Okay, good morning and welcome to this week's edition of Encompass Live. I am your host, Krista Burns, here at the Nebraska Library Commission. Encompass Live is the Commission's weekly online event where we cover any activities that may be of interest to librarians and library staff, whoever across the state. We do these sessions every Wednesday morning at 10 a.m. Central Time. They are recorded, and so you can watch all of our recordings later if you want to. We do all sorts of things. We do presentations, interviews, book reviews, sometimes little mini training sessions. Maybe that's what we'd consider this. I don't know. A demo.
A line between a presentation and a training, I guess.
Okay. And we have guest speakers that come in, and we also have commission staff. Today we have commission staff. Emily Nimsakont, sitting here next to me, is our cataloging librarian here at the Library Commission, and she is going to tell us everything we want to know about linked data and what's going on with that. So I will hand over to Emily, and probably you'll need to go back. Yeah.
Cool.
Let's get this there. Take it away.
All right. Thanks, Krista. And thank you to all of you for joining us. I see that we have quite a large group today. That's really exciting. I like that there's a lot of people out there who are interested in the topic. And as Krista said, please do jump in at any time if you have questions. There are a lot of you out there, and I want to be able to interact if you have questions. So she's really good at monitoring the question box, so she'll just jump in and flag me down.
Absolutely.
So linked data is a topic that I've been interested in for a little while. I think it's cool that so many of you are there and interested in it. I like talking about it. I think it's something that should be on the radar of people in libraries, especially people who work with cataloging and bibliographic data. And, if you had asked me a year ago, that's pretty much about all I would have said. Maybe it should be on people's radar. They should be thinking about it a little bit. I thought it was kind of a cool idea. I presented about it at our state library conference in 2010, so a little bit over a year ago.
Yeah.
But it was just kind of, I phrased it as, just kind of something that's a little bit out there further down the road, maybe thinking about it a little bit. And then something happened a few months ago that kind of changed my mind and made me think this is maybe a little bit more urgent than that for people to know about. And that was an announcement from the Library of Congress. In October of last year, right at the very end of October, I believe it was the 31st, they said they were going to announce it sometime during October, and they took all the way to the end of the month. But they issued an announcement about what they're calling their Bibliographic Framework Transition Initiative, which basically is the project to move away from using MARC, machine-readable cataloging, as the encoding standard for our cataloging. And that, in and of itself, kind of grew out of the announcement that the Library of Congress made in last summer, I think it was right around the time of the ALA annual conference, about the implementation decision for Resource Description and Access, RDA, the new cataloging rules that are being designed to replace AACR2. And the announcement there was that they will be implemented no sooner than January of 2013, but there were a number of conditions that they said had to be met before it was even considered implementing it. And one of those conditions was, I believe they phrased it as significant progress on a replacement for MARC. So that was, since June, everybody had kind of been expecting something like this, some news about what exactly they might pursue as a replacement for MARC. And so this October announcement, which was called A Bibliographic Framework for the Digital Age, addressed that issue. And here's some quotes from this statement. They said, the library community's data carrier, MARC, is based on 40-year-old techniques for data management and is out of step with programming styles of today. And therefore, something new is now needed. And that, as I said, was kind of expected based on the announcement in the summer. However, one thing that kind of surprised me a little bit, maybe, was that they went ahead and said that they will be focused on linked data principles and mechanisms. They're going to pursue linked data as an alternative replacement for MARC. And I have the URL for this announcement down there small at the screen. I do just want to say, don't worry about copying down URLs. We will have links for you at the end.
Yes.
Krista always does a great job.
When the recording is posted, the PowerPoint will be up there, and any URLs or websites or anything mentioned at all will be included as well. So you'll have that with the recording.
So anyway, when I read this announcement, I went, whoa, okay, I've been sort of saying linked data is this cool thing to think about, but this sort of it makes it a little bit more relevant. I still think it won't happen necessarily soon enough to implement RDA by January 2013, because that's coming up pretty fast.
That was their original.
They said no sooner than January 2013. So they get themselves some wiggle room there, and I think we're going, I think it will be later. That's my own personal opinion. I'm not an expert on it by any means, but But they did just make the statement that they're pursuing linked data as the replacement for MARC. And so I said, well, I guess we all better start out learning what linked data is. I do want to preface this by saying this is an extremely, extremely basic introduction to the concepts of linked data. I think that's really all people need at this point. You know, if you're working with library data, I think you should be aware of it. I also am not a linked data expert myself, so I can't give you an extremely technical explanation of it, but I do have a lot of ideas about how it relates to library data and why it is important for people working in libraries to know about. And so I want to share those with you, and just hopefully you'll come away from this session with feeling pretty good about a basic understanding of linked data. So when looking for basic definitions, I sometimes like to start out with Wikipedia, so that's what I did in this case, and then we'll kind of jump off from there and explain in more detail what the heck this all means. According to Wikipedia, linked data describes a method of publishing structured data so that it can be interlinked and become more useful. Basically, it's data that's linked, which you could probably tell from the name. But to go on a little bit, it builds upon standard web technologies, but rather than using them to serve web pages for human readers, it extends them to share information in a way that can be read automatically by computers. And that's a big deal to take away from this. Linked data makes, to a certain extent, the meaning of information understood by computers. And because of this, it enables data from different sources to be connected and queried, which is kind of the point of this whole thing. And we want to be able to bring together data from different sources rather than only be able to search one source at a time. That's why this data is linked, so that you can do searches of wider bases of information. One thing I'd like to point out is a little bit of a terminology difference. You may also hear the term semantic web when talking about things like this, and you may be wondering how that's different from linked data. And there's kind of a few different schools of thought on this. Some people think they mean exactly the same thing. And you will kind of hear them used interchangeably sometimes. And so I may say semantic web sometimes later on in this presentation. I've been trying to stick mostly to linked data. But I think there is a little bit of a distinction between the two in that linked data makes the semantic web possible. Semantic web is kind of describing the web and what it will look like when everything is out there in linked data, if that ever happens. But linked data is what makes it possible, and linked data can be done on a smaller scale. I think the reason people like to use that over the semantic web is because it will be a very, very, very long time before the entire web is encoded in information like this. But there can be smaller linked data projects going on, and there are right now, and so that's what we try and focus on that term. You might also hear Web 3.0 as another synonym for the semantic web, so that's out there too. But we're going to try and focus with linked data, but if I slip up and say semantic web, you know what I mean. And what linked data makes possible, what the semantic web is, one way of thinking about it and how it's different from the web that we have now is that the web now is a web of documents, and what we're working towards with linked data is a web of data. And to explain that, this picture kind of shows the web as it is now. There's a bunch of resources out there, web pages that are connected, and we have hypertext links. You know, they are connected, but it's kind of just one resource linking to one resource without a lot of meaning between the links, for example. It's not a very specific level of linking. You can pretty much link anything to anything out there on the web. Contrast that to the idea of a web of data. It's much more granular level of linking. Rather than linking just between one resource to another resource, you can link specific pieces of data within a resource to another specific piece of data within another resource and create a much more intricate web, I guess. Another part of linked data that is important to point out is that relationships are key. When you are creating those links between pieces of data, you really want them to be based on meaningful relationships. You know, right now web pages can be linked to each other for pretty much any reason. There doesn't really have to be a whole lot of rhyme or reason behind why they're linked. And if there is a reason, it's usually one that humans are capable of understanding. You know, you read the text on one page and it includes a hypertext link and it tells you to go to this other page, and because of the context, you know why you're clicking on that link, but the machine doesn't. The computer has no idea what the relationship between these two pieces of information are. And so relationships are made a lot more explicit, and they're made machine understandable in linked data. And the reason they can do this is because there's meaning encoded in the coding used for linked data. Right now, let's look at HTML here. This is what web pages are written in now. And the tags, which are those things in angle brackets around the text, they are good for telling the computer how to display different types of text, but they don't tell it anything at all about the meaning. So in that first example up there, it says this is a heading and this is a paragraph. And the difference between them, because of the tags, is not really understandable. The tags don't have anything to do with the content. Actually, in that first example, I guess they do just by coincidence, because
but they don't have to.
But they don't have to. That's the second example. The heading is just the heading of the page, and the tags tell the computer things like make the heading bigger than the paragraphs, put a space before and after the paragraph, but they don't tell it anything about what the information means. You can contrast that to the encoding for linked data. This is an example of RDF, which is Resource Description Framework, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail later. And it's expressed in this example in XML. And you can just see, looking at it, there's more information included in those tags. It tells you things like, we're talking about a CD here, and it has information, tells you which information is the artist, which information is the country it was produced in, the company, the price, the year, and that is all embedded within the encoding. You don't have to, a human looking at it doesn't have to be the one to interpret the meaning. Machines can understand what we're talking about a little bit. And then once you have this encoding that helps make meaning possible, then the real key to linked data is to go ahead and create links. You don't want an example like I looked at before where it's just all information we're providing. Ideally, you want to link to other sources. So you can see, we're talking about a book in this case, and that second line has a link to an editorial review. Instead of just putting the author's name in there, there's a link to an entity where you can find out information about the author. And that really is the magic of linked data when you start linking to other things that are out there on the web. It's not just all your own information out there. And that goes a long way towards creating that web of data, again, that we talked about before. So to review, those are the things that I think are sort of the four main points about linked data. We have data instead of documents. We're dealing with much more granular pieces of information. Relationships are key. These relationships are expressed through encoded meaning. And there are links between entities. So we have all this out there happening. So what? What does this actually do for us? It sounds really cool, but what's the practical application? Why does this make a difference? Well, a sentence that I've heard before to sum it up is that linked data basically makes the web into a database. Instead of just searching discrete information sources, you can kind of search the whole web as a whole. But it's different than just doing a regular Google search because of the encoded meaning, and you can be much more specific rather than just relying on the actual keywords that you use to type into your search. There can be some encoded understanding on the part of the machine of what you're looking for. If you're looking for something about authors who lived in England, and there's a resource out there that talks about a woman who lived in London, but it doesn't specify whether it's London, Ontario, or London, England. If it's encoded as linked data, you might have more of a chance of finding that, and it's a more specified way of bringing together different sources of information. And sometimes it's hard to explain linked data because a lot of it happens behind the scenes. If it works really well, you may not notice that much of a difference between the traditional sources you're used to working with, but it's just a lot more seamless way of bringing together information from different resources. So that was the basic introduction to what linked data is. Did we have any questions come in or anything?
Not during that. Does anybody have any questions? If you do, type them into the questions section in your GoToWebinar interface, and Emily can answer them for you.
We're going to shift gears just a little bit at this point, so if there are any questions we need to clear up before we go on, that would be great, but if not, just type them in as they occur to you.
Yep.
So how does linked data happen? How do we do this? Why is this, what do you need to know in order to start thinking about making linked data happen? If you've been to any training or read anything or seen any other presentations on linked data, you might have seen these 4 linked data principles before. These were laid out by Tim Berners-Lee, Sir Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web, and who was kind of the driving force behind linked data and the semantic web. Some people think that that was really his vision for the web in the first place, was to do this, and the technology just wasn't there.
Right.
So he's a big driving force behind linked data. And I'll go through these 4 principles, and then we'll talk a little bit more in depth about some of the definitions of these things and things that you probably won't necessarily understand right off the bat. The 4 principles are: use URIs, Uniform Resource Identifiers, as names for things. More specifically, use HTTP URIs so people can look up these names. When someone looks up a URI, provide useful information using the standards, and then include links to other URIs so they can discover more things. So let's talk about some of the components of those principles, starting with URIs. As I said, this stands for Uniform Resource Identifiers. And basically, it's a string of characters used to uniquely identify a name or a resource on the web. So it's something that represents a particular entity that is unique to that entity. And really, as librarians, we should get this. Things like ISBNs, OCLC numbers. I know ISBNs aren't as unique as they're supposed to be all the time, but in theory, they should be unique identifiers. OCLC numbers, Library of Congress control numbers, we get the idea of a single resource having a unique identifier. So that's kind of a way to think about URIs. Now the second principle was that you should use HTTP URIs. And basically this means that there should be an address where this URI can be located on the web so people can go there and find out information. So you would have to, it looks like a URL basically, like for a website. You would have a domain where you set up if you had a whole bunch of URIs relating to the same thing, you'd probably put them at the same domain. And then that last part, thing 1, it could be a particular number, it could be just anything that uniquely identifies that resource. And when a human goes to this, would be text, readable information that a human can understand, but then there also would be RDF information that a computer can understand when links are made. Speaking of RDF, I talked about that a little bit before. It's a data model, and it is Resource Description Framework is what RDF stands for. It describes relationships based on things that are called triples. You might also see them called statements. Basically, they're called triples because they have 3 parts: subject, predicate, and object. And I've listed a URL there for the World Wide Web Consortium page on RDF, which has a lot of really good starting information if you're just learning about RDF. So here are some examples of an RDF statement or triple. We have subject, and then the predicate is the link to the object. So basically 2 entities that are linked by a relationship. So in this case, something relating to a book that we might see if we were working with linked data in a library setting. The book, A Christmas Carol, is subject, has author is the predicate, and Charles Dickens is the object. And you can extend these, all the way out. Statements can be linked together into things that are called graphs. That's when you have more than one relationship. So Christmas Carol has the author Charles Dickens. It also, this particular edition we're looking at, has the publisher Penguin. And you can just go on and create a number of different relationships that way. And to bring this back together with the URIs, these entities should be represented by URIs in order to make the most of linked data. Actually, the subject and the predicate must be URIs, and the object can be a URI or just a string of text or something like that, or a number or something like that. So this is kind of how that would look if the graph had URIs for the entities. And to bring us back to what we were looking at before, the graphs, the things that we were looking at, that's sort of a conceptual way of representing it, but the actual RDF would probably look something like this, with links to the resources for the creator and the publisher from something that says that we are talking about this particular book. One last thing that wasn't mentioned in those 4 linked data principles, but is something that I think is important to mention, is that these relationships, these entities, they can come from ontologies, and an ontology is a vocabulary of specific terms to be used to describe resources. Basically, we're dealing with controlled vocabularies here. Again, sound familiar? It's not completely unfamiliar to librarians and catalogers in particular. You need to have a particular way for talking about the relationships and the resources that you're describing. So one thing I kind of like, it's not always easy to find really basic information about linked data, but I do like that there are things like the 4 linked data principles and this next thing that I'm going to talk about, which really just kind of attempt to simplify it, make it really understandable, break it down into basic steps, things you can do if you're interested in this stuff. And so the next thing I'm going to talk about is the 5 stars of linked open data. This again comes from Tim Berners-Lee, and it was just kind of an attempt to say, hey, if you're interested in this, this is something you can do. You don't have to necessarily take it all the way to the 5th star and do everything you can to do perfect linked data and know everything about everything in URIs and RDF. But there are small steps. If you put it out there even in a little bit and get 1 star, then somebody else can take it and run with it and go the rest of the way. So it's kind of like 1 star is good, and then the rest of them are better and better and better, and the 5th star is the most you can possibly do. So the first one is to just make your data out there on the web. Make it available to other people. If you want to earn 2 stars, make it available as structured data. And this would be like, instead of having an image of a table, to actually put like an Excel spreadsheet out there, something that's in a more structured format, something where people can access discrete pieces of information, things like that. And then the 3rd star is to use a non-proprietary format. So instead of that Excel spreadsheet, maybe use a CSV file, something that's not proprietary, that people can access even if they don't have Excel, things like that. The 4th star is where you probably have to get into a little bit more technical know-how, using open standards like using our URIs and using RDF. And I hadn't even talked about Sparkle yet, but there's a language called Sparkle, which is a query language for finding this type of data. And so that's where you really have to kind of get into technical knowledge. But that's the 4th star, is to use these standards so people can identify your stuff and link to it. And then the 5th star is to do the opposite and link your data to other people's data to provide context. Because really, that is the whole point of linked data, is these links. So to get the absolute 5 stars, you need to be creating links rather than just putting your information out there. But that's kind of a continuum for things you can do if you want to contribute to things to create a linked data environment. Now you'll notice at the top there's a phrase that we hadn't really used before. I've been saying linked data this whole time, but this says linked open data. And so I just wanted to take a little sidebar quickly and talk about that. Not all linked data is open. Not all open data is linked. Ideally it should be both. It should be both linked to other sources, using the standards so that it can be linked, and it should be open, meaning available under an open license, saying yes, people can reuse this stuff. So like a Creative Commons license, something like that. So ideally, in the best of all possible worlds, the way that linked data is really going to happen and people are going to link to other things is if linked data is linked open data. So keep that in mind. So why should libraries care about linked data? Now we know what it is, we know kind of how to make it happen, but what does it actually mean for libraries? Why is this something that the Library of Congress is considering to replace MARC? Well, for one thing, as is obvious by the fact that it might be the way to replace MARC, is there will be some changes to bibliographic data that would be possible because of linked data. So in traditional cataloging that we're used to dealing with bibliographic records. A record is one package, it has pieces of information within it, but it still all kind of comes together as one thing, a record. And the elements, like author and title, really only have meaning in the context of the record. We could look at a bibliographic record and say, okay, there's the author in a 100 field, and there's a title in a 245 field, and so because they are together in the same record, we know as a human looking at it that the author is the author of that particular title. But if you just encounter one of those out there in the wild by itself, you wouldn't know necessarily that it was related to the other. And the computers certainly don't have a way of knowing this. We can exchange bibliographic records, but there's not really a way to exchange the individual pieces of information within a record. This is kind of going back to what we were looking at before with the web of documents versus web of data. We have these records that are kind of documents. They're these monolithic pieces of information that you can't really break down into a smaller level. So contrast that to a linked data environment. A bibliographic record in this case is made up of many pieces of data. And I honestly think that, if this does happen, if we do get used to using linked data for our catalogs, I think we're going to kind of have to get rid of the term bibliographic record and start thinking about bibliographic data instead. I think we're just going to have to think about things on a much smaller level. There may not really be any such thing as a record anymore. So anyway, we have these pieces of data, and more importantly, the relationships between these pieces of data are defined. So it's encoded so that you know that this particular person is the author of this title, and that relationship can be linked whether or not you encounter these pieces of information within a bibliographic record or not. So because of this, the boundaries of the record can be dissolved. We don't have to have these discrete packages of information anymore. And the data can interact with other information on the web. Information that we've created can be linked to other people who want to use it out there. Or we can bring in information. If you reverse the directions on those arrows there, we can bring in information from other sources out there. An example of this might be right now, we'll talk about this more later, but the Library of Congress has their authority records and their subject headings available in linked data. And so if you were able to link to their URI for a particular subject heading, every time it was updated, you wouldn't have to go back into your catalog and change it. It would just change automatically.
Bring it in. Nice.
Yeah. And again, some other things, there are lots of pieces of data out there that could be logged in. A lot of people import reviews from Amazon into their catalog, and right now they do that through like APIs, but it would be a lot smoother to do that through linked data. So that's kind of the big picture view. I think what they're thinking when they're suggesting that we pursue linked data as a replacement to MARC is that this is what our bibliographic data reality will be someday. I think there are some other ways that this could impact libraries. One thing that occurs to me is that it would open up doors for new federated search possibilities. When I say that, I mean, maybe federated search is kind of an outdated term, but we're all onto discovery layers where we bring in things from our databases and things from our digital collections and things from our catalog. But if all of that was encoded in linked data, I think that would make that a lot more simple, a lot easier. It could really be searched in more meaningful ways. So I think that's something to keep in mind. Even if we don't necessarily make connections outside of the library world, we could probably make better connections between our resources using linked data. I also think that it would provide new ways of searching our catalogs, even if we didn't necessarily link to other things. I think thinking about the relationships between entities in our catalog in a different way could, and having systems that support this, of course, could make things kind of interesting. Right now, unless you have a known item, you have a title you're looking for, it's not necessarily intuitive how to use our catalog. There's not a lot of way of interacting with things like subject headings, unless our users know how to navigate our controlled vocabularies. What I picture when I think about a linked data catalog would be something like, you don't necessarily know that you're looking for Jane Austen, but you know that you want female writers who lived in England and wrote in the 1800s. And I can picture you kind of being able to limit your search by those and pop up with an author, Jane Austen, or another author that you had never heard of before. And you find all those things without knowing the author's name. And I think this is one way in which you can tell that RDA was, to a certain extent, if not designed for a linked data environment, it at least works pretty well with a linked data environment. One of the big changes with RDA is not necessarily changes to bibliographic records, but changes to authority records. There's a lot more required elements that require things to put in, things like a person's area of occupation, what they did, where they lived, and so there's a lot more supplemental information about their life. And so I think you can see that there's a shift in focus from just books and resources being the main entities in our catalog to also focusing on the authors and other entities, and allowing people to come at a search in a number of different directions. So I think that's something that RDA can make possible. It's something that linked data can make possible. And I think it's kind of exciting.
Yeah, that is a lot more the way people seem to think.
Right, yeah. You don't have to know what you're looking for or guess what word we use for it.
Yeah, catalogs have never been really worked the way people really think.
Yeah, so I think that would be really great if we could start trying to do that a little bit. And kind of thinking more outside the box as far as how linked data could affect librarians maybe more than libraries is I think that we could find new homes for librarian skill. I think that we could make ourselves really useful to the larger information science community. As I pointed out things as we go along, we know unique identifiers, controlled vocabulary, we know this stuff, I think, in some ways people say that we're behind the times in the library community because we've been holding on to MARC and, our encoding format is really behind the times. But I think in a lot of ways, people in the computer science community haven't even necessarily, they're just now with linked data and stuff starting to think about some of the controlled vocabulary issues that we have been thinking about for years, decades, centuries.
Right.
So
they're just now starting to think like librarians.
Exactly. So I think that we really need to be better at marketing ourselves, and I think we can build a lot of bridges and get our information connected to non-library information out there, and it could be pretty cool. So I referred to some of these as we've gone along, but are there sources of linked library data? Yes, there are some places where people have made information available in formats that can be used as linked data. At id.loc.gov, you will find the Library of Congress subject headings and Library of Congress authority headings available in a linked data format. So for example, this is the page for the subject heading Love Songs, and the URI for it is listed at the top of the page, so that is the unique identifier for this concept. And it's linked to other things. It's, if it had a broader term, songs, for example, that would link you to another URI. And then down at the bottom under alternate formats, you can see that these are machine-readable formats. This is how a computer would access this information. So we've got RDF in XML, for example, there at the top one. So it's both human-readable and machine-readable. Another resource that you may want to be aware of is the Virtual International Authority File, which is an OCLC project. And that's basically an attempt to bring together authority files from multiple national libraries. So to link up the authority records in different languages for the same thing so that they can be identified in a linked data format. Another OCLC project is Dewey.info, where they're making the Dewey summaries available as linked data. And to go back to talking about RDA, a lot of the vocabularies used in RDA are available as linked data. And again, we're getting back to kind of the idea of controlled vocabularies. A lot of the push towards in RDA is towards using specific elements as part of your record, and then specific terms to describe a lot of the elements. So we have a list. You can see there's URIs for a number of these different elements. And then, for example, I went to the one called content type, which is a prescribed element in RDA. And this is the list of a controlled vocabulary, the terms that you can use to describe the content type of an item. And each of them has their own URI. So in a linked data environment, you could substitute this URI instead of actually typing this text into your record. And then I went to one of those terms for content type, and spoken word was the one I chose. And you'll see preferred label is listed there as one of the components of this element term. And we have it both in English and in German. And I wanted to point that out as just kind of an interesting thing about linked data is that it's kind of language neutral. The same URI can stand for a concept in a number of different languages, so it will make it a lot easier to operate in a multilingual environment. So those are some sources of bibliographic linked data out there. And again, basically the point is to link it up with other sources of information. This is something that you may have seen, again, if you've been interested in linked data at all. It's a linked open data cloud, and it's basically just an illustration of sources of information out there. Wow. Yeah, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And I check in every once in a while and see how it's grown. And the bibliographic information corner of this cloud is right up there in the top right. And so it just keeps growing, and so you'll see that types of information that are more similar to each other are closer to each other in the cloud because they overlap a lot and they're linked. LCSH is linked to, I think, the medical subject headings are available. There are other things out there that relate to library information. So it's just kind of cool to see the bigger universe that we're a part of here when we talk about linked data.
I think this is good that sometimes I think libraries, and especially cataloging, they're kind of very insular. They're like, this is for what I'm doing for my library. I don't need to pay attention to anything out there, kind of with blinders on. And this is more that we're getting more like the whole, connecting with the whole web. Everything's
True.
open. I mean, librarians do have that instinct of sharing when it comes to interlibrary and all that stuff and sharing information. But sometimes when it comes to the bibliographic data and the cataloging part of it, they don't think beyond this item that I'm doing right now.
You're right. I think that'll be a real shift if the linked data mindset kind of takes hold. Of course, this obviously all can be useful to our users because we can bring in other information too. Yeah. So we're not abandoning our users to think about the wider information resources in the universe. But yeah, I think it would kind of be a shift in mindset a lot of times from how we're used to operating. So now I just want to give some sort of practical examples of what the heck does linked data look like. I said before that it's sometimes kind of hard to really illustrate it because it's all happening behind the scenes, honestly. It really, and if it's done well, it shouldn't really throw you for a loop. You should just be able to use it like any other resource and just think, wow, this is a really cool resource, and maybe not necessarily know about where things are coming from. But there are some linked data projects out there, and I just wanted to mention a couple, specifically ones that relate to libraries and other cultural institutions, just to kind of say, hey, this is happening. It's not necessarily far off down the road. It does exist. One that I learned about recently is called NINES.org, and NINES stands for Networked Infrastructure for 19th Century Electronic Scholarship. I'm sure I remember that correctly. And so basically it's digital humanities items, digital items relating to 19th century scholarship that people have made out there. And they're all from all different sources. They're aggregated from a number of different places using linked data technology. So for example, they have those tags over there, and I clicked on the first one, abolitionism, and got these two resources. One, the top one, says it comes from Prints and Photographs Division. That's the Library of Congress Prints and Photographs Division, so there's one source. And the second one comes from Project Muse. And again, you wouldn't necessarily know the techniques behind this, but it is being aggregated using linked data technology. I think down there it says they have 112 federated sources that they're using to pull from. So it's kind of a neat project to keep an eye on. Another one that I think I haven't necessarily seen a lot of practical applications coming out of it yet, but it's a pretty big project where they're trying to gather institutions and stuff to work on it, is the Civil War Data 150 project. And they're basically just trying to collaborate and create resources that allow people to find a lot of different information about the Civil War and particular soldiers, particular regiments. They'll use photographs from the Library of Congress and link it to a record that the National Park Service has, actually providing information about the people in the photograph. And they're really recruiting kind of crowdsourcing. They're going to create like some data games to get people to say, this is a picture of a battlefield, yes or no, and just data that can be encoded. So it's really a kind of a cool collaborative project to keep your eye on. Like I said, I don't think I've necessarily seen a lot of things where you can point to and say, go search this, and this is what they've done. But they're working. I think they just launched it in maybe April of 2011, so it's pretty new.
This is also great that you can just get involved in this. If you're interested in Civil War, go here and see what they're, like you said, the whole crowdsourcing aspect of it, see what they're looking for help.
Absolutely, yeah.
And if you can participate in it, it's not just for the experts.
Right,
for
exactly.
Some of these projects.
It's not just, yeah. I think they said they're going to create some games that are marketed towards like middle schoolers and high schoolers, and so that people in the history class can say, go look these pictures and identify things, and then that becomes part of this. Yeah, so I do think it's a really neat project to keep your eye on if you're at all interested in linked data and how it relates to historical resources. And yeah, you can even get involved. Now another example that I always like to talk about when I talk about linked data is openlibrary.org. And I have to say that I don't think they're actually technically qualified as linked data and that they're not really drawing in from other sources right now, but I like to point it out as an example of what a linked data search could look like. Like I said before, we started kind of taking linked data approaches with the entities in our catalog. You can kind of think about searching things differently. I think the Open Library has a lot of really neat search options. For example, if you search for an author's name in a library catalog, and even if you are familiar enough to know to put it in the author field rather than just typing it in as a keyword, what you'll get back is a list of books that the author wrote, basically, which might be exactly what you're looking for. But the Open Library approach, they have kind of author pages where you have a little bit of biographical information about the author. You have the books that she wrote there. But then over on the side, they have the subject headings that apply to her books, places that she wrote about, people that she wrote about or who are related to her. And so I just, again, think it's a way of thinking differently about the entities in our catalog. We don't have to just focus on the books, the resources. We can provide a richer experience with dealing with our authors. Or they had things like this for a page for a subject heading. You can go there and find a bunch of different information about the subject heading love or something, for example. And so I always like to point this out when I talk about linked data. I also, interestingly enough, always show this as an example when I talk about RDA and FRBR, the model that it's based on, the functional requirements for bibliographic records. Because again, it's all about bringing out relationships, looking at different entities and how the author relates to the book. And so again, I think that's a really good way that RDA and FRBR stuff lines up with linked data. I think we are perhaps moving in the right direction to consider a linked data form of encoding to go along with RDA. I think the changes for RDA will be a lot more noticeable in linked data than they ever were in MARC. And so I think that that's really a good kind of synchronicity between the two. Now, anybody who's attended my presentations before know that I always like to throw a lot of resources at you. I'm pretty lucky in that I have, part of my job is to do training like this, and I have the luxury of looking for resources and saying, hey, this is really cool, and spending some time evaluating things. And so I like to share the results of my findings with you and point out the things that you can go to and make the most of your time if you want to learn a little bit about these things. And so speaking of making the most of your time, I found the 30-minute guide to RDF and linked data. So it goes a little bit more in depth than I went today as far as the technical aspects of it. If you want to learn, maybe take another little baby step and learn more about RDF, I think it's a really great resource. It is specifically targeted towards librarians. I think it originally was a presentation at the Code for Lib conference sometime in the last couple of years. So I find this is a really, really useful resource. I think there's a lot of times not a lot of really basic resources. I've delved into things where I read about linked data and I say, I really want to learn how to do this. I know it's really cool, but I want to know how to do it, and I just get overwhelmed. There's just so many really technical resources out there, so I just want to point out that this is a very good, basic introduction. I don't think you will be overwhelmed if you read this. Another good, pretty, layman's language resource that I found recently was a report on a workshop that happened at Stanford University just this summer, the end of June, beginning of July. And they published a report on the things that they talked about and sort of some action items that they thought would be useful. And it did come out of the Stanford University libraries, so it is another pretty library-centric resource, which I think is good. So I would give that a read. I don't remember how long it is, but it's not extremely overwhelming. It's really digestible, and I thought they wrote it in pretty plain language, so I think that if you're not extremely experienced with linked data, this is a good place to look. And then a blog that I'd like to point out is lodlam.net, with a hyphen in the middle there, and that stands for Linked Open Data in Libraries, Archives, and Museums. And some of the folks involved with that Civil War data project are also involved with the lodlam effort. It started out as a conference that took place also this summer. It was a little bit earlier in June in San Francisco. It was the International Linked Open Data in Libraries, Archives, and Museums Summit. And a lot of people just got together to kind of identify, hey, what can we be doing with this? So some of it is the reports about what happened at that summit, but since then they also keep it up pretty regularly as a blog and post presentations or reports, things that are of interest. So, if it's something that you just kind of want to keep in your feed reader to, be reminded every once in a while that, hey, linked data is out there, maybe I should think about it, this is a good one to subscribe to, I think. And speaking of blogs, another one that I like to read is called Managing Metadata. It's by a woman named Laura Smart, who's a librarian at Caltech Libraries. And the reason I like it is because she is just kind of jumping in and doing a linked data project. They're trying to set up, I think, the names of the faculty at Caltech in a linked data format so that it could possibly be used later, either within their own resources for your institutional repository, things like that, or possibly used outside. And so she's just really open and honest about her experiences, and well, this kind of stumped me for a while, but then I figured out this, and I went to this conference and I had this revelation. So if you want to kind of read somebody who was figuring it out for herself, I think this is a really, really good resource to go to find out some information about somebody delving into the practicalities of making linked data happen. And there is a linked data interest group at ALA. If you're a member of ALA, maybe you're going to Midwinter coming up here in a couple days, I think, or maybe next week, but pretty soon. Yeah. The address I have there is for their ALA Connect page, community. I wasn't able to really find another good web presence for them, but it's a collaborative effort between LIDA and ELECT, so the techie people and the catalog, the tech services people. So I think it should be really interesting. They're going to have some meetings in midwinter. I haven't been to ALA in the last couple of years, but they've had linked data presentations going pretty strong for the last couple of years. So that is another thing to keep in mind if you are attending any ALA conferences. And again, I just wanted to point back to the Library of Congress. As I said, this is kind of what started my whole interest in giving this presentation anyways, because the Library of Congress is seriously considering linked data as a replacement for MARC. So their whole project to move away from MARC is called the Bibliographic Framework Transition Initiative, and that is the URL for that. So if you are interested at all, keep that in mind. If you'd like to kind of be aware of the discussions going on surrounding this, they do have a listserv. If you go to that URL on the last page, they have a link where you can join the listserv. BibFrame for the Bibliographic Framework Transition Initiative, and I'm subscribed to it. It's not extremely high traffic, so I don't think it will overwhelm you, but it's kind of, again, it's a good way when something from this list pops up in my inbox, I can say, oh yeah, I kind of wanted to pay attention to this, so it's not something that will overwhelm you, but it is something that, if you don't necessarily have the time to go out and seek out resources relating to linked data, it will just kind of tickle your brain every once in a while, and you can kind of keep track of how things are going, because I think it's really an interesting thing to keep up with, and this could be a really innovative thing in the library community. And that is basically what I have. So are there any more questions?
No questions. If you have any questions, you can use your questions section of your GoToWebinar interface. Type them in. Emily can answer them for you. Nobody had any questions during the session.
Well,
either you answer them all or you overwhelmed them. Or
let's hope it's not the latter. But if you are overwhelmed, my contact information is up there. You can always, if you need some time to process this, and then you go, hey, what did she say about that? Feel free to contact me. Give me an email. Give me a call. There's the address there for our links. Crystal will be sending that out with the recording email as well anyway, and the slides will eventually be posted online too.
Yeah, we do have some comments that, yes, great presentation, looking forward to the resources. So yeah, I'm sure that's what a lot of people will be doing is delving more into it later, like you did. Yes, I'm sure.
Like
and
I said,
it's a lot to absorb.
It really is, yeah. And so I basically just wanted to present the very basics and point you in the direction of some places where you can learn more, because that's really the important part.
And yes, the slides will be, when the recording is processed and posted, a link to the slides will be available to you as well, so you'll be able to get all of these PowerPoint slides for yourself and to use them, go back and reread them, whatever you need to. Couple thanks and a wealth of information.
Yeah. Cool. Glad if you all find it useful.
Yep. Okay. All right. Well, it doesn't look like anybody has any real questions at the moment, and that's fine. We're like we said, if you have more questions, use the resources she has here. Contact Emily. She's willing to answer anybody's questions if you have them to discuss this or whatever you want to. Get involved in some of those places too, Library of Congress and ALA, where there are people talking about it amongst themselves too.
So that's really a good way to get your feet wet and jump into the conversation.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Emily.
You bet.
I've been hearing a lot about linked data too, and I kind of know a little bit, like you said, the whole semantic web sort of relationship, but I'm glad that I know a lot more about it now too, and I'm going to pay attention more to what's going on out there. Like I said, I think it's really good for having the things that we've been using, the catalogs, the bibliographic information, whatever, to work the way where our brains actually work, rather than the way, in the past we just had to figure out how do we make this computer figure out what we want, and like you said, the resources we had back then when Tim Berners-Lee was creating the internet, he had the grand ideas, but we didn't have the technology.
Exactly. So now we're maybe going to actually see some of them realized.
Now we're getting there, yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you very much, everyone, for attending this morning. I hope you join us next week when our topic in Encompass Live is discovery tools. You can compete with Google. We're Deanne Allison from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln here. We'll be talking about how you can create discovery tools and create your own information portal at your library to get the best resources for your whoever your community is, your students, your patrons, whatever. So she'll be with us next week, 10 a.m. Central Time, as we always do every week. If there's no last minute questions, and it looks like there isn't anything urgent, we will say thank you and goodbye. Thanks a lot.